So if America says MAGA, India says Atmanirbharta. In some senses, until 2008, from 1948 to 2008, it's almost a 60-year trajectory that we have seen in which the world became more and more integrated and interdependent.
One fundamental building block for the integrated global order was to make trade frictionless, which is why WTO was set up, and WTO framed a set of rules. And the primary objective of setting those rules was that you don't need to kind of bilaterally go and negotiate with everybody. You work along those rules, then trade becomes pretty much simple.
The kind of interdependence that has been created over the last 25-30 years is so deep that it is not easy to completely reset these supply chains, completely reset the trade dependencies. Domestic production will continue to, be important, and even in areas like semiconductors, electronics, we do need to make sure that our ability to produce things locally and domestically gains a significant uplift. Therefore, in my mind, I think the focus will be on national security related aspects, and certain industries will actually have more prominence in this than others.
And welcome to another very interesting episode of Open Dialogue. Since World War II, the global economy has been moving in a direction of integration and globalization. The last couple of years have seen a shift, and a massive shift in this trajectory, and we are moving towards now what is being called as the geoeconomic fragmentation. So what exactly is geoeconomic fragmentation? What does it mean? And what does it imply for countries like us and our development paths? This is the discussion topic for today. Joining me today for this conversation is Neeraj Gambhir. Neeraj, welcome to the show. So Neeraj, why don't we start with a little bit of a historical perspective on how the world has been shaping, let's say since the World War II.
So since the World War II, I think the idea was that you need to have more global trade going on and more global integration, and that would in some senses help in terms of the overall increase in the overall welfare of the world, right? And some of these ideas were actually captured by the economists like David Ricardo, whose concept was that if two countries trade with each other and they both have their comparative advantages, then there is an overall increase in the welfare for both the countries. The countries basically produce and trade the things in which they specialize in, and that in general is overall beneficial, right? That's the core thesis with which the global trade integration started. Obviously, the period of World War II, post-World War II, was a period of reconstruction in Europe as well as in Japan. Up until, I think up until 1970s, or when the Cold War broke out, right? This was kind of a steady path in which the world economy went. Cold War was kind of a break in this process, and when you had a clear identification of two blocks, there was an America-led, free world, democratic, liberalized world bloc, and there was a USSR-led communist bloc, right? So the world kind of divided in between these two blocks. And post the fall of Berlin Wall, which is when the USSR disintegrated into its, multiple countries, it kind of became a unipolar world where America was the largest dominant power in the world, both politically as well as economically. And the path was to go towards increased liberalized economic regime and democratic regime. In fact, many erstwhile European countries who were a part of the Russian sphere of influence were also moving towards democratic values, opening up their markets, becoming capital market economies, right? This trend was significantly was given a significant impetus when China joined World Trade Organization in 2000. And that was a significant milestone because up until then China was a very closed, self-sufficient economy. It was a large economy, And between 2000 and 2008, in a very short period of time of less than 10 years, China actually became uh, the production house of the world, right? Where a significant amount of manufacturing shifted from the Western world. So, in some senses, until 2008, from 1948 to 2008, it's almost a 60-year trajectory that we have seen in which the world became more and more integrated um, and interdependent. In 2005, Thomas Friedman wrote his book called The World is Flat. Incidentally, he wrote this book when he visited Bangalore, basis his experiences in Bangalore. And the notion was that because of information technology developments, because of growth in countries like China, their integration with the rest of the world, even India between 1995 to 2008 actually integrated with the rest of the world, opened up its markets, opened up its economy. So because of these trends, the world was becoming a flat place where the capital was highly mobile, the production was highly mobile, and the supply chains were getting distributed across the world, right? This trend kind of came to a halt post the 2008-10 global financial crisis. That's the time when people realized that there are downsides to this highly integrated economy. Problems in one side of the world, particularly in US, actually reverberated across the world and created significant challenges for all the economies in the world. So that was the first downside that the world saw in terms of an integrated economy. And the second shock, which was the COVID shock of 2019, was again brought to the fore the vulnerabilities of a globally distributed supply chain system. And COVID was a major disruption, right? Since then, we have entered into an era of what is now being called as geoeconomic fragmentation. Geoeconomic fragmentation is a term that was coined in one of the research papers of IMF in 2023, and is basically referring to the concept of, in some senses, policy-driven separation or policy-driven reduction in interdependence between various economies. And we are seeing that trend gain a significant shape and size and momentum in the last 2 to 3 years. So that's the whole genesis of this
Great.
entire process.
Thanks, Neeraj, for running through. So, if I would just take a few points from what you said. One is this basis for kind of this global integration was this notion that, let's say you and I are two different countries and you are good at making X. Let's say you are great at making bread and I am great at making butter. Then if I make more and more of butter and sell to you and you make more and more of bread and sell to me, we will both be better off than both of us making bread and butter separately, because you will make butter less efficiently than I will and I'll make bread less efficiently than you will. And so overall economic output may not be optimized.
Yeah.
And so this was at the highest level.
So important thing in this is to know that we need to trade amongst ourselves.
Correct.
Right? So I should be selling the bread that I make and you should be selling the butter that you make to me. And therefore, as a result of that, I don't need to make the butter here because you can make it more cheaply than I can, right?
Correct. So this was the basic kind of thesis. From there, actually, we've come to a place where if you think of the global supply chains, they are extremely complicated. Everything is extremely specialized, and there are, as an example, if we take auto, then auto has maybe 4 levels of people who are making different types of things and then supplying, and which finally comes to a OEM who's then integrating everything and selling. And similarly, if you think of, let's say, phones, etc., right, these are all global supply chains. It's not even local supply chains. So it's become extremely complicated, globally intertwined, highly optimized, just in time kind of a world. And that, by the way, it did give great outcomes. It helped everybody in the world. Probably some economies more than others, but even the economies who were less benefited were benefited still. So it was a system that worked. But as you said, and we'll come into the reasons and so on and so forth, off late there is a little bit of kind of questioning of this. So Neeraj, if you just go back, like before we come to going forward, there are 3-4, I would say, fundamental building blocks of this integrated economy. and maybe worthwhile just getting your perspective also. So one is just the supply chains that you need to trade. So having uh, frictionless trade is maybe one. Second, this notion of a reserve currency and that kind of being the basis of how economies work is maybe a second one. There is a physical integration here, right? Like there are trade routes and there are like Suez Canal or Panama Canal, etc. are in some ways a physical part of this. So what are, like, it'll be great to hear from you, what are these 4-5 fundamental building blocks, and subsequently we'll also talk about how those are changing and what could impact.
Yeah. So I think the first and foremost is to realize that there is a very high degree of specialization that has happened.
Right.
As a result of this interdependence, the economic interdependence that countries have gotten into. And incidentally, this economic interdependence is independent of the political inclinations, whether it is democracy, whether it is autocracy, it doesn't really matter.
Right.
But in some senses, that interdependence has come
Right.
about. And the biggest interdependence is between Western world and China.
Right.
Right, where China has become the manufacturing hub
Right.
for rest of the world in a very, very short span of time, right? In some senses, part of the reason why China became the manufacturing hub for the world is because of the factors of production being cheap, right? Most importantly, cheap labor to start with. And then, to some extent, state-supplied capital, which also helped Chinese industry to grow and acquire size and bring in manufacturing efficiencies, which otherwise would not have been possible. So this combination, in some senses, worked perfectly well for them. The Western world, on the other hand, became more services oriented. So, for example, the share of services in America's GDP is now today significantly larger than the share of manufacturing in their GDP, right? So they became more service oriented. What are these services? I think the biggest one of them is financial services, right? So today America has the deepest capital markets, the biggest financial system, the biggest banking system, and they provide these financial services to the entire world in some senses. The entire world goes to America to raise capital, right? So you saw this sort of division of labor, if I may say, between these economies, and this division of labor was helped by two or three things. One is certainly the desire to bring some of the economies like China into mainstream. So in some senses, the American administration, the American political thought process was, and this goes back to early 90s and 2000s, that if we have to, and America was for a long period of time was, especially post World War II, was thinking that they have to support growth of liberalized democratic world order in rest of the world, because that's their way of thinking. And the belief was that if you bring China into mainstream trade, mainstream trade, the benefits that China will get will propel it towards becoming a more open, more liberalized, more democratic economy, right? So there was a political connotation to that as well, not just purely economic, but the result was substantially economic. I would say that information technology post dot-com era has had uh, a sort of accelerating effect on this trend, because with the advent of internet, with the advent of seamless communication across various parts of the world at the speed of light, you are no longer sort of constrained by the physical presence, right, in many, many ways. And that in some senses helped to spread out production, because production is now, it's easier to manage and control production even if it is in different parts of the world, because you are connected for using information technology far efficiently. And then there is obviously this whole trend of global capital. As countries, particularly countries like India and some other parts of the developing world like Brazil, Mexico, etc., reduce their barriers for capital, and they attracted and they called for FDI investments in their countries. Helped with information technology, capital also became globally mobile. So these three things, I think, in some senses acted in a very virtuous way together to create the kind of world economic order that we have, which is highly interdependent in some senses.
Right. And so, Neeraj, now let's talk about what's happening and what's resulting in this geo fragmentation. So, like in your mind, what are the top 2-3 things that are top?
I think the first and foremost is that yes, while on an aggregate basis, uh, trade and division of labor and specialization between different countries has helped the welfare of the economies. But there are effects here which are not necessarily what were anticipated, right? For example, a large part of American manufacturing, which used to support America's blue collar, middle income workers, has actually shifted out of US, and that's true for Europe as well, right? And as that job scene has kind of become difficult for this set of population, it has exerted pressure on their political economy to think of ways in which to help this segment cope with this change. See, the change of this nature, the integration of this nature is always, it's not a straightforward process. It's always a little bit difficult process for certain parts of the economy, right? While overall aggregate basis, we are all better off. And if it happens in a very short span of time, it's even more painful, right? So I think the biggest play here is how the middle income population of the Western world has dealt with this change, as they have seen a large part of their manufacturing blue collar jobs getting exported to the developing world, right? Whether it's China or whether it's Mexico. At the same point in time, I think there is a desire to think about national security, desire to think about uh, interdependence for certain critical areas, right? Which has become more and more prominent. A case in point is semiconductors, right? Up until very recently, nobody really cared about semiconductor industry, right? Where the chips are designed, where they're manufactured, and who is doing it, right? And as the US and China political rivalry has come into fore, the place of production of semiconductors and the raw materials that go into the manufacture of semiconductors has become an increasingly important aspect of this whole play, right? We all know that TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, is the largest semiconductor producer and is based in Taiwan. The company that supplies the equipment to make these semiconductors, lithographic equipment to semiconductors, is actually one single company called ASML, which is the largest market share. It's based in Netherlands. So it's a Dutch company. So it basically creates vulnerabilities that if suddenly TSMC was not able to produce as much, or there were some, because of geopolitical risk, there were some disruptions, then the whole world whole world manufacturing comes to a standstill, which is what we incidentally saw during COVID time, right? So I think some of these trends have also played at the back of this thought process. And therefore, now there is an attempt to diversify the place of semiconductor production in different parts of the world. I mean, US is setting up a fab, Japan is setting up a fab, even though with the help of TSMC itself, right? So the idea is that you diversify these supply chains, don't create too much dependence on one area. And there is a dramatic change in the way, I would say, US has seen China's resurgence or China's emergence in this global economic order. Back in 2000, the thought process was that if you bring China into mainstream trade and mainstream economics, you will see a shift towards liberalized and democratic China. That has not happened. In fact, it's happened the other way around. China has become, in some senses, maybe a little bit more autocratic than it was back in 2000. And second, the size of Chinese economy and the influence that it has on world order has created a sense of rivalry between the two countries, between America and China. And that has, in some senses, led US to think about its dependence upon China. So multiple factors at play here, but largely driven by the domestic concerns and nationalistic views about about your own economy, particularly in US and to some extent in West as well.
Right. So Neeraj, if we take this theme now and just deep dive a little bit into what exactly is happening. So what is happening in this geoeconomic fragmentation? What kind of things are being done? What areas get impacted because of that?
I think first and foremost, and the stuff that is most visible to all of us is tariffs.
Right.
Right? Tariffs are becoming the main tool, largely again led by America and American administration. And US is thinking of tariffs as a way to bring production back, bring manufacturing back to its shores, right? Particularly in areas which it is thinking of as critical and important for its national security. Clearly, there is a focus on bringing semiconductor production back. And if you look at the recent announcements around tariffs on pharmaceuticals, there is a clear bent towards pushing domestic production of pharma products as well, right? In fact, just recently, I think over the weekend maybe, there has been a deal signed between the US government and Pfizer, where Pfizer has been given a 3-year reprieve from the tariffs with the objective of manufacturing in US. So clearly, tariffs are playing as a important sort of lever tool from a US standpoint in terms of doing some of this rebalancing back or creating more jobs onshore. The second aspect of this is, and it's related, is that when China was brought into the World Economic Frame, WTO was the main umbrella organization for supporting trade in the world. WTO was in some senses, global arbiter, rule setting body. Over a period of time, as this geofragmentation process has kicked in, the role of organizations like WTO has actually become quite insignificant in some senses. Countries are now talking about bilateral and multilateral trade agreements, right? And it's becoming a little bit of multi-way game rather than a one-way game that everybody sort of goes through WTO rules. Countries are deciding what they want to do amongst each other. India has signed a FTA with UK. We are discussing and negotiating an FTA with Europe, and many more such trade agreements are being discussed and looked upon. That's I think the second aspect of this process that is kind of getting worked out. And the third aspect of this, which even though it is getting talked about a lot, but we haven't seen any meaningful development and progress, is the use of US dollar as the reserve currency in the world and payment currency in the world. And in some senses, fragmentation of the global payment system. I'll just pause here. If you have more questions, I will then get into the details of this.
Yeah, absolutely. On each of these, actually.
Yeah.
So one, we spoke about one fundamental building block of the erstwhile or even today, but the integrated global order was to make trade frictionless, which is why WTO was set up, and WTO framed a set of rules. And the primary objective of setting those rules was that you don't need to kind of bilaterally go and negotiate with everybody. You work along those rules, then trade becomes pretty much simple. One of the things that WTO tried to do very hard, I mean, to be part of WTO, was that you had to bring your tariffs to a level of parity, and you couldn't just randomly put tariffs, except in certain sensitive situations, etc. But otherwise, you had to kind of, and there were ways to calculate. Actually, there were many legal cases that went to WTO and where the WTO was the arbiter in terms of whether some countries dumping products or the government is subsidizing whatever, right? So one fundamental building block that is now being re-architected is this trade through tariffs, and hence the importance of institutions like WTO basically going away. The second one you spoke about was the reserve currency and the global payment system, SWIFT and the like, and we go into details of that. There is also kind of weaponization of many of these things, right? Like, and I'm sure we'll cover that also, which is the reserve currency status has been weaponized. And, as an example, Russia's reserves were completely seized. So there is that. There is the physical side of it. Like, as an example, the putting on the sanctions on Chabahar, which was till now outside, is a way of weaponizing physical supply routes as well. So there is that as well. So we'll go into each of these, Neeraj, and maybe since we ended on the currency and payment systems, let's kind of talk a little bit about that, right?
Yeah, I think one of the side effects of the emerging world order post World War II was the emergence of US dollar as a global reserve currency, the dominant global reserve currency, right? Before that, it used to be British pound, but along with gaining, in some senses, becoming the largest economy in the world, gaining economic might and political might, US also had one of the best institutional mechanisms in the world for capital markets, right? And raising of capital, sanctity of rule of law, institutions and the legal system to back up the capital markets based economic architecture, right? Which is what gave the world the confidence to continue to use US dollar as the main currency for trade, and because it was the main currency for trade, it also became the main currency for reserves for global central banks, right? Because US dollar could be trusted, it was a stable currency, financial system was strong, and the institutional mechanism was extremely good. Particularly the institutional mechanism around making sure that the inflation remains low. US had an inflation target of 2% for a long period of time, supported by the independence of US central bank, which is Federal Reserve Bank, right? All of these factors, sorry.
So actually after World War, we had the Bretton Woods
Yes,
arrangement where currencies were pegged to gold,
that's right.
including the US dollar. And that gave a kind of lot of comfort to people that, because the dollar is pegged, and actually all currencies were pegged to gold. So, kind of the belief in dollar came from its peg to the gold, and obviously all these institutional mechanisms, which then in 1971 and with the deep kind of the
oil shock.
Along with the oil shock, Nixon and his team basically broke this one, the connection to dollar or of dollar to gold. But dollar continued to remain the primary reserve currency because of the confidence that it had built by then.
Yeah. So, I mean, since you talk about Bretton Woods, I think about this, the establishment of Bretton Woods, IMF, World Bank, IFC. Many of these institutions was basically to support a global order. Correct. Which was of a particular kind, which is basically liberal democratic global order, which is encouraging openness of capital flows, open economies. Economies were being asked to liberalize, follow the particular path to make it market oriented, etc., etc. So I think all of that, in some senses, played to the strong role that US dollar came to have over a period of time. And two things were quite kind of reflecting this. One is the amount of global trade that is still getting invoiced and settled in US dollars. And second, the share of US dollars in the central bank's reserves, right? So both of these are kind of corresponding effects. While we haven't seen a major change in that situation, because what is required, and we've discussed in a previous podcast as to what does it require for a currency to become a global reserve currency or a globally acceptable currency. But there is, and particularly after the weaponization of SWIFT during the Russia's sanctions, I think there is a worry that the world is over dependent on US payment system and US settlement system, right? And if a country was, for whatever reason, to be cut off from that, it will have a significant devastating impact on its economy. Therefore, there are attempts and there are, thought processes to say that how can we have a more balanced payment system in which different countries can have different roles, different currencies can have different roles. I think it's still a topic of discussion. I don't think we've reached anywhere close to having any other currency, even if it is Chinese yuan, coming close to what US dollar is. But there is a perceptible increase, for example, of usage of Chinese yuan in trade, right? It's still less than 10, it's still single digit share, but there is a substantial increase. It's possible that China and some of the countries that they have a sphere of influence on are using yuan now to invoice and settle their trades. Second, central banks' holdings of gold have actually seen a significant rise in the last 2 to 3 years, right? So while central banks are not diversifying away from US dollar into other currencies, there is clearly a diversification away from US dollar into gold, which obviously is considered to be the ultimate store of value, right, which humanity has seen over thousands of years. So that trend is clearly visible there.
And I recently saw some data which said that central bank holding of gold now is higher than central bank holding of US treasuries.
Yeah, I mean, that's clearly one effect that you're seeing. And I think a lot of this diversification is being led by emerging market economies, including India.
Right. And so this is a clear kind of signal of at least the central banks and government saying, look, I mean, the payment system and so on, so
Yeah.
maybe much longer term. But in the maybe a medium term, we have to ensure that our reserves are more diversified.
Yeah.
Because A, the dollar could be weaponized. B, also there's a question on the value of the dollar itself in kind of if, trade shrinks and debt is anyway very high there.
Yeah, value of US dollar is a slightly different aspect. I think we can get into it later, but it's not just about the value of US dollar. I think if you think about this, about $350 plus billion of Russia's reserves were impounded.
Correct.
Right? And a large part of that in Europe, by the way, as a part of the sanctions package that was unveiled post the Ukraine war. While the logic and the rationale of that is very clear from a humanitarian standpoint of view, but for most emerging market economies, it was also a bit of a wake-up call to say that if you have so much dependence on one currency, one system, right? The emerging geopolitical scenarios and the realities could mean that you would have a significant impact on you if there was something like this, to happen to any emerging market economy. So obviously, diversification away from one currency, spreading out of your assets in different places. And it's not just about investing in gold. It's also about having gold in your own jurisdiction.
Yes.
Right? For example, India has imported a lot of gold back into India for storage in India. It's no longer held in vaults in London or US, right? So it's not just about investing in a particular thing, but physical storage as well has become important.
Well, this is another very interesting point here. Just to kind of deep dive into this a little bit. Earlier, actually, a lot of the gold was stored in London. So let's say when India would buy gold, India would on paper own the gold, but the gold would be located in some vaults in London, in the Bank of England, I think, if I'm not mistaken, or something like that. What has happened recently actually is that countries have said, look, not only do I want to own the gold on paper, I want physical custody of it.
That's right.
And so they've started importing the gold. And a lot of gold actually has moved out of these vaults and, into China, India and the like. Which again is somewhere there is a little bit of, trust deficit kind of seeping in, right? Like earlier, government would say, look, it's fine. The gold is there. and not with me, because when I want to sell, by the way, it's easy. I don't need to kind of move, gold from my coffers to, let's say I want tomorrow to sell gold to somebody, then I don't need to move physical gold from my coffers, move it to their coffers. It's all kept in a central place, and we just kind of exchange paper. Gold remains there only. It's just the ownership has changed hands. But now people are saying, no, not only do I want to do this, I want the physical custody of gold. So that is very interesting.
Yeah. So it's again symptomatic of the world that we are getting into or we're living in today, where I think national security is becoming far more paramount. And each country is basically thinking about its own national security, aspects of national security, dependence upon other countries, right? And to me, this whole slogan of Atmanirbharta that we've talked about, that our Prime Minister has talked about, is clearly a sort of reflection of the same thought process that the rest of the world is also going through. Correct? So if America says MAGA, India says Atmanirbharta, right? So it's the same process that we need to now think about what kind of dependence that we are creating on rest of the world and which part of the world, and in the event of a conflict or in the event of a war or something like that, how will this dependence play out for my national economy, right? So clearly governments are all thinking about it. To me, this trend is a little bit different than a trend of just plain and simple onshoring of manufacturing, right? Because it's onshoring of manufacturing is purely economic, but this is now a slightly different thought process. It's also geopolitical. It's also
More strategic.
Strategic in that sense.
Yep. And the interesting part about this, Neeraj, is that it is not only, countries like India, but also if you think of Europe.
Yeah.
As an example, after many, many years, countries like Germany are now starting to invest back in building their military,
Yeah.
hardware,
Defense.
and, having a strong army and so on and so forth, which earlier Europe had kind of outsourced its defense to the US via NATO. Now they are saying, no, we need our own army, we need our own, all kinds of equipments and the like. So it is not just, it's not a West versus or developed country versus emerging countries, etc. It is even within developed countries you see this kind of a tussle emerge.
So great point. One of the aspects of this geoeconomic fragmentation is, in some senses, a reset of what is called transatlantic partnership, right? Post World War II, Europe and America were the strongest of allies. You had creation of NATO, which was basically saying that, security concerns are common. An attack on one country is the attack of another country, which is a part of the NATO. And now, US is basically asking the question that, why should I bear this cost, right? What is in it for me? And actually has pushed back on Europe to say that it's your defense, and you got to invest in your own defense, right? So while NATO has not completely been abandoned, but there are certainly questions about how to distribute the cost of common defense across various parts of the NATO. And that has certainly created some strain in the transatlantic partnership between US and Europe. Europe has understood the message, but Europe being Europe has its own complexities because it's like a amalgamation of many economies of different size and shape. So things don't necessarily move as coherently and as speedily as they probably move in US. But they have got the message, and there is a clear push now amongst all European countries to increase their defense spending, to bring it to a level of say 3% of GDP, so that their defense in some senses is not outsourced to US, and US is refusing to sort of take on that cost. While we all know about Germany, but the most significant part of this German increase in its defense expenditure is that Germany, post World War II, had a very strong resistance towards doing deficit spending. So there were very strict rules in German law about what kind of fiscal deficits Germany can run, right? Part of the reason is that Weimar Republic saw a big episode of hyperinflation before the World War II, and there is these memories of that that have carried on. For the first time, Germany has decided to break that rule, and that's very, very significant, to basically spend money on defense. And while Germany can do it, many economies like France and Italy and Spain will probably struggle because their budgets don't have that kind of leeway. But still, it's a common commitment across Europe. And speaking of Europe, I think I must add that while we talked about the shift towards geofragmentation, I kind of forgot to mention that one of the very important aspects of shift towards geofragmentation was Brexit, right? Brexit in some senses was breaking away of Europe into two parts, UK being a very significant economy in Europe. Counterintuitively or counterfactually, this strain on transatlantic partnership has also brought Europe to some extent more together than it was before, right? So this whole notion of common defense expenditure, common standards of defense production, and etc. Has UK being as much a party to it as some of the other large European countries. And in some senses, Europe sees Russia as a common threat, right? And which has also been kind of brought Europe together. But on a broader basis, it has definitely created more fragmentation in the world that was there before this period.
Great. Now, Neeraj, one thing that this implicitly means is that, we are kind of going a little bit contrary to the original thesis, which is, you make better bread, I make better butter, let's kind of trade. Now I'm saying, actually, I'm not sure Neeraj will give me the bread. So I need some bread production in my shore. And you are likewise thinking, saying that, look, Samir may not give me the butter when I want. So you need to kind of create something. So what this does mean is that at the global level, efficiencies, productivities, costs, etc., we should see, it likely will mean that we see worse of outcomes. So how does this, what does this mean from a, let's say, a 10-15 year macro trajectory perspective?
So I think there are 3 or 4 different aspects of this reset of the global world order, global economic order, and geofragmentation. First of all, we have to understand that the kind of interdependence that has been created over the last 25-30 years is so deep that it is not easy to completely reset these supply chains, to completely reset the trade dependencies, right? And maybe it's not even beneficial to completely redo it in some senses. Therefore, in my mind, I think the focus will be on national security related aspects, and certain industries will actually have more prominence in this than others, right? So we've clearly seen semiconductors as one area where there is increased and heightened aspects of controls, not just tariffs but also export controls, import controls. Linked to semiconductor production is the whole aspect of energy security, right? That's also going to be very, very important. I mean, US has now become a energy point of view self-sufficient, but there are parts of Europe, including countries like Germany, and certainly emerging market economies like India, which have to clearly worry about energy security, right? So I think that will continue to be another driving factor of this geofragmentation. The third aspect of this, the sensitivity about climate control, so rather the climate related aspects becomes higher. And as economies move towards net zero carbon and stuff like that, by the way, that is not given away, right? There's still focus on that. The need to move towards clean energy will also be very, very important, right? And how do you secure that for your economies will become very important. And in that context, rare earth materials, because they are, the funding in some senses block for clean energy. So that's the third aspect. The fourth aspect will be defense, right? So defense And even in that context, rare earth materials become very, very important. Defense production, defense supplies, um, defense technology, these are all going to be the areas in which you will see higher and higher fragmentation and, in some senses, onshoring or reshoring of production. To me, it's therefore not a complete and wholesale reset of global supply chains. Maybe that will happen over the next 20, 25 years, who knows. But certainly in the short term, in the medium term, it doesn't look like that is something that is very easy and feasible. But there will be attempts to look at these areas and see how we can secure your own future for each and every economy. We will also have to see how the world financial order sort of changes as a result of this reset, right? Whether we truly have a alternative to US dollar as a payment and a reserve currency, and whether alternative mechanisms and means of settling payments emerge. Incidentally, while on the one hand we've had this notion of fragmentation driven by, for example, the embargo on SWIFT, we also have emergence of cryptocurrencies and the digital and token assets, which are fundamentally global in nature, right? These methods of paying and these methods of settling are not linked to any particular economy. They're effectively global in some senses. So they are acting as a counterweight towards the fragmentation of the financial system. I think from specific countries' point of view, and I think in this reset, each bloc, whether it is US, whether it is Europe, whether it is China, and whether it's emerging market economies like India, Brazil, etc., will have to think about how do we sort of align with different parts of the world and what kind of arrangements that we have to make sure that your own national interests are served in the best way.
Understood. Great. From a we covered many aspects, Neeraj. The industrial policy, the rare earths, semiconductors, and the like. From a financial markets perspective, do you see anything changing?
I think from a financial markets perspective, there are obviously aspects to this. First of all, the capital, particularly in the space of FDI, may not be as mobile as it was, say, 10 to 15 years ago, right? When you have such a significant shift undergoing in the global economic order, it's hard to imagine that capital will be as freely mobile, because people will worry as to where they're putting their capital in, what is going to happen, what kind of alliances will be created over a period of time, and what impact this capital could have. Therefore, FDI movement, capital movement, could have an impact, right? We are already seeing, as far as India is concerned, we've seen significant outflows from our equity market in this year. We've seen slowdown on FDI, net FDI investments into the country so far this year. And to me, this is partly due to where Indian equity markets were at a point in time, but also partly because of this whole concern about how the tariff situation is going to play out, and whether, India being the China plus one country plays out in the near term. So I think that will have its impact on currencies, and that will have its impact on the ability of central banks to sustain independent monetary policies. Thankfully, for a country like India, we have actually developed a fairly significant reserves. We have significant reserves. Our external position is strong, so I don't expect a big shock. But these are the things which will continue to play as far as the national policy making is concerned.
Understood. So, moving on to the final part of this, Neeraj, which is these are some fairly fundamental changes. How should a country like India think about its next 10 years? And what are 3-4 things that we may need to change in the way that we are?
I think it's a very, very evolving and volatile situation. Things are changing very, very rapidly. And there are no permanent shifts that you can discern. Things can happen and then undo themselves over a short period of time. So it's very hard to come up with very fixed ideas and very fixed thought processes at this point in time. In some senses, you're a little bit being reactive to how the world is evolving, right? But given the context and given what we've seen in the last, I would say, about 15 odd years since the GFC has evolved, I think it's becoming fairly clear that we do need to continue to focus on our, number one, on our energy security. I think it's extremely important, because the less dependent we are on outside world for our energy security, the more is our degrees of freedom in some senses to pursue the economic policy that we want to pursue. I mean, case in point is the pressure that US is putting on India for its oil imports from Russia. I mean, it's in some senses you're getting singled out, even though some countries which are a part of the European Union are like Hungary, which are importing as much oil, maybe less, but significant importers of oil from Russia as well, and refusing to change that. So clearly energy security is extremely important. And in that energy security, I think the shift towards clean energy, solar energy that we are actually seeing in the country, it's a very, very welcome change. I think it's something that needs to be supported, needs to be encouraged. For many of us who have seen the path of power sector in this country over the last, say, about 20 odd years, worry that too much exuberance in one sector can eventually lead to problems. But hopefully this time it is different. Hopefully this time we have sorted out some of those issues that we've faced in the past. But it's extremely important that this sector move towards clean energy, whether it is solar, whether it is wind, whether it is nuclear, and we think of all the solutions to make it. That's one. Second, I think on defense, right? Clearly had a significant dependence on Russia in terms of our defense equipment, right? And given the way the world has evolved, there seems to be a problem in terms of that dependence, right? So as we think about our future, developing our own indigenous defense industry, and to me, Ukraine has proved that you can do it, right? I mean, look at the amount of change in Ukraine's tech capability around defense over the last 3 years into the war. Today, they are supposed to be the best drone producers in the world, right? Which is really the remarkable change. In some senses, tells you that you can do it, because the nature of the modern warfare will look very, very different from what we've seen in the past. And it's no longer, I mean, you can innovate, you can come up with your own solutions which can stand you in a long way. And the third, I think, while it is said that we have skipped the manufacturing period that China has in some senses gone through, and we've straight away jumped into a services economy, domestic production will continue to be important. And even in areas like semiconductors, electronics, we do need to make sure that our ability to produce things locally and domestically gains a significant uplift. The good part for us is that as compared to many other emerging market economies, particularly smaller emerging market economies, we are still in a sort of self-dependent, inward-looking economy, right? Yes, our exports have increased, our integration with the rest of the world has increased significantly, but it's still a large domestic market, right? And India has natural resources in many, many, many areas, right? Maybe not in energy, but there are some other areas where we have. We will, as the third or fourth largest economy in some time, we will be extremely important to the world. If we pursue some of these goals well, we should be able to create a sort of outcome for ourselves which is not that much dependent upon the rest of the world. So clearly this movement towards Atmanirbharta has some underlying logic to it.
Thanks, Neeraj, for that excellent conversation. So we covered a wide gamut of things. We started with the post-World War II situation, and we spoke about how post-World War II the world started to come together. Many things came together to help that. The formation of what are called the Bretton Woods institutions, World Bank, IMF, and the likes, the World Trade Organization, and the emergence of the dollar as a reserve currency. All of these came together to ensure that the world operates in a way in which the comparative advantages are fully utilized and fully leveraged. And that has resulted in the creation of very complex supply chains, extreme specialization, which has worked very well for the world in general. In the recent past, though, some of the shortcomings of this, or the, how should I say, collateral impact of globalization have come to the fore. Some of these are around certain, changes of this nature impact a certain type of people more than certain other type of people, and particularly working class and so on. When change happens in such a short time, it is not that easy to adjust. So there is, in local economies, there is this how should I say, this tension, or this feeling of being left behind, which is now kind of coming up, and as a result putting pressure on this global economic landscape. Second is the emergence of kind of people starting to think about national security because of specific events that have happened. And what people have realized is that through COVID in particular, starting with, GFC first and then COVID, and then subsequently the wars that have happened, countries have started to realize that, you know, excessive reliance on other countries could be detrimental in situations of this nature. And so you need to have certain amount of self-reliance when it comes to sensitive areas. So that's another thing that has kind of driven this. How this has manifested in multiple ways, primarily through trade tariffs, which at one point in time were almost a taboo. And actually the same countries were trying to bring tariffs lower across the world, have now started to put tariffs and, kind of bring onshore a lot of production. So that is one. Second, there has been weaponization of many things, including the reserves, as we spoke about, the payment system we spoke about. So that's the other way in which this has happened. And what countries are now realizing is that specific areas, so high tech, semiconductors, energy, countries are not fully comfortable outsourcing it entirely. And defense, by the way, the fourth thing is over defense. And so countries are saying we need to be self-reliant in these areas, and that's what they're working towards. The impact of this in your mind is that obviously there'll be some inefficiencies, but what we discuss is that it's unlikely the global trade ecosystem is now so deeply entrenched that it's unlikely that across everything you can defragment and bring it onshore. So likely what will happen is that specific sectors and specific areas will see this happen. And you named all of these: energy, semiconductors, high tech, defense, are areas where we will see countries work towards self-reliance. In other areas, some of it may happen, but it will be very long term. Very likely that they will continue to remain global with, some maybe redundancies built in. For a country like India, we start with a little bit of a benefit that we are actually a consumption economy and not an export economy, unlike many of our peers around us actually, which is a benefit. Having said that, we are also likely to face some of these challenges, and the Atmanirbhar area that our government is pushing for is something that we need to really kind of double click on and double down on, because in areas such as energy, in semiconductors, defense equipment, we have reliance externally, and that reliance we need to bring down so that we can also from a risk perspective cover ourselves and mitigate ourselves. So that's the quick summary of the entire conversation. Thanks a lot, Neeraj, for
Thank you.
doing this. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
I did. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for listening into this episode of Open Dialogue. I hope you enjoyed this as much as we've enjoyed bringing it to you. We are overwhelmed by the response that we've received and really look forward to your comments and feedback. Do like and subscribe to our channel to keep track of new episodes that are coming through. Thank you.